James, welcome to the show, mate. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Hello. I'm just putting the phone on Do Not Disturb. Hi. Yeah, look, great to be on, and thank you very much for allowing this to happen.
Yeah, of
Excited.
course. What we always do at the beginning is just get people to walk through their background. Can you get us up to speed on what you've done and sort of what you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, probably the best introduction I can do is where it all started. So 18 to 21, snowboard instructor in Canada. Had no ambition of studying at university at all. Lived in the mountains, chasing snow and après ski. And then at 21, decided to embark on a higher education academic career at Liverpool John Moores University in the northwest of England. And there I studied my bachelor's in sport and exercise science, master's in sports physiology, and then went on straight onto a very applied PhD in applied physiology, body composition, performance nutrition with rugby league players. Very lucky and fortunate to be supervised by Professors Graham Close and James Morton, where I learned an enormous amount from them and the university, and really put myself out there as a PhD student and undergrad and master's student just to get as much applied experience as I could, so that when I went on to the PhD, it wasn't completely alien to me. Um, PhD funding run out, finished a 4.5 year PhD, submitted that. The funding had run out, and it was decided, time to get a real job, be a big man, and go and get a job in pro sport. So, applied for a role at England football at the FA, St George's Park, managed to land that, and then I had 4 years there, servicing the men's and the women's pathway from under 15s all the way up to the senior squads. And that was alongside Dr. Chris Rosimus, a superb time, learnt a lot off of him. And then kind of missed rugby a little bit, to be honest. So got myself back into rugby, where I then led a nutrition performance strategy and department at the Bristol Bears Rugby Union down in the southwest now of the UK. Um, and then that really was like the path to get into England rugby, because that was always my North Star. It was always the thing that I wrote down on the fridge and said that I wanted to do, was to go and work at the RFU, work for England, and work for my country in rugby. So I then had 18 months with the Red Roses, and then I've now been with the England rugby senior men team for 2 years. Outside of football and rugby, I've also worked in boxing. Really enjoy helping the combat sport athletes importantly, make weight safely. And then once you've got a safe and healthy fighter, you can then help them to fuel for the demands of a championship boxing fight, and kind of recover as best as possible as well. So that's a bit of a whistle stop tour into kind of my academics and then my applied experience.
Who were you at Liverpool John Moores with? Because I feel like you were probably part of or close to the Liverpool John Moores class of '92 of lots of people in the field right now who were there at the same time. Were you in that sort of batch of people that are now in elite sport from Liverpool?
Most probably, yeah. And do you know what it is? Like, we quite often reflect on this because, you've got, I'm not going to name names, but there was a core group of us that were all studying PhDs together. And we all enjoyed a beer, we all enjoyed the social side of it, but we all really enjoyed what we were doing from a study point of view. And it was this incredible washing machine of PhD students that really wanted to commit to the field of science and do some really good, genuine applied research project. Muscle biopsies live at rugby match play, or muscle biopsies doing glycogen depletion studies to really challenge the conventional thinking about glycogen and fueling for the work required. Coming off of Sam Impey and Dr. James Morton's work. And that was like, it was an insane melting pot of good quality blokes that are all very good friends with each other and all enjoyed living in Liverpool and just having that social side of it as well. And you're right. There's a lot of us now that are still very good mates, and we all support each other in all of our little projects that we do. And I think everyone, if not all of us, is working in applied sport to some degree and to very good levels. Or people have got their own businesses like Warren with Hytro. So it's yeah, it was a great group to be part of.
Yeah, very cool. Obviously, the big topic for us today is going to be nutrition, and we've not really had that many nutrition episodes, if I'm honest. We had James Collins way back, and then
Yeah, good
more
bloke.
recently we had Bryony, who's a performance chef. So we always have physios and S&C coaches on and sports scientists, but nutrition's probably the area where I'm most out of depth, and we probably had the fewer experts in that field, probably because of that.
Yeah.
So I think I'll probably get a lot out of this one today from a selfish perspective. Just to kind of kick us off, could you walk us through sort of, you've worked with boxers through to national teams. How do you personally kind of support and build in, world leading recovery strategies? I know that's really broad, but you can kind of take that where you want.
Yeah, I think there's been some really good focus in the last couple of years on like fueling for the work required and getting ready for performance. Um, and look, I've been there before, where you work in applied practice, where like the performance is done, the game is complete, and then all of a sudden, like the recovery strategies aren't as world leading as the fueling strategies that go before the comp. So. Yeah, I kind of work really hard on shifting the mindset of the athletes to say, look, guys, we need to recover just as well as we do fueling. In particular, like a sport like rugby, because you've got not only exercise-induced muscle damage, but you've got now that impact-induced muscle damage where you've got blunt force trauma, you've got blokes running into each other for fun, and they love it, and they live it, and they breathe it. But with that, you get a lot of inflammatory markers and a lot of muscle damage that needs support. And so it's funny, I was just doing a course on this earlier today about recovery strategies. And really, the first thing to consider is the timing of the recovery in line with when the next performance and or training session might be, because that will kind of dictate as to how aggressive you need to be with that recovery. But if we take an example like, let's say, a Wimbledon tournament where you've got a tournament scenario, or you might have a World Cup campaign where you've got 3 games in 9 days, and it's really important that you recover from the first game or the quarterfinals so that you're fresh for the semis, then anyone would agree, I think, in the literature that aggressive carbohydrate recovery is going to be paramount the moment that the game finishes. And we talk about that first 4 hour window. You've got this window of opportunity where they've just finished the competition, the tennis match, the rugby match, the football match. They're normally in the changing room. They're in and around the stadium facility, and you've got an opportunity there to hit them with your first kind of bucket of recovery nutrition. And I found in practice that that tends to be a lot easier if it's liquid based and or finger food, because they're not going to sit down in a changing room with a steak on their lap and start chopping into a steak, but they will probably nibble on bits of sushi or chicken goujons or a chocolate milk as an example, or a recovery smoothie or a shake that you might give them. So from a nutrient point of view, a macro point of view, we aim for about 1 gram per kilo of carbohydrate per body mass of that athlete. So if you're a 100 kilo player, then we'd be looking at 100 grams of carbohydrates for the first 4 hours in that recovery window to maximize the replenishment of muscle glycogen. If you then combine that carbohydrate intake with protein, then you're gonna increase the uptake of glycogen back into the muscle and support that overall muscle recovery. And of course, the protein is then going to be super important for muscle repair. So not just getting the energy back into the muscle from a glycogen resynthesis point of view, but now we need to repair the damaged muscle, whether that's exercise-induced muscle damage or impact-induced muscle damage. So from a protein point of view, ideally you want at least 20, but probably 30, maybe 40 grams of protein to be consumed in that early window so that you can start kickstarting muscle recovery. And then there's other things that we can bring in as well. You'll see people looking at the cherry gels, the New Zealand blackcurrant powder or tablets from an antioxidant point of view. There's also products on the market that have omega-3s with the protein combined so that we can increase omega-3 fatty acid from an anti-inflammatory point of view. But I think the recovery nutrition in that first window of opportunity is paramount. The opposite of all of that is that you have a player that gets into the change room and then they crack open a beer and they start drinking a beer, and you've actually put no good nutrition into them first before the alcohol goes in. So I think it's really important, and of course, it goes without saying on top of that that hydration is a massive factor, and a lot of practitioners will be weighing athletes before competition and after competition to give them a really good guidance on, well, you've lost X amount of fluid and energy in that match. It's really important that we now replenish X amount of fluid to make sure that we've got that hydration back in check where it needs to be. So that would be the first window, and then normally what you then find is the athletes will then go from changing room. They'll go and see family. They'll do media obligations. Maybe there's some doping control that they have to attend to, and then if it's like me, you'll then get them back to the hotel, and then you can have a proper sit down meal, and that's where you can then start to be quite creative with the buffet that you provide, to make sure that again you're hitting adequate carbohydrate replacement and protein. If the athlete is going home, then there's going to be some education there on, what is it they need to eat when they go back. Can we get them to have a salmon fillet with some whole grain carbohydrates, a load of vegetables? Can we have a recovery smoothie before they go to bed? Um, we find that that buffet meal post match is one that we can be a little bit treaty with, because we want them to have a large amount of carbohydrates, and there's ways that you can do that and make the food taste amazing, i.e., adding on some desserts or bringing in a bit of sorbet or some ice cream. But also, it's an opportunity. The lads have, they've had their good competition of the week, and if we put on some homemade burgers or chicken burgers, they're going to get devoured, and we're absolutely fine with that. So hopefully that gives a bit of an overview as to kind of what you can do in practice, but the importance of the timing and the window of opportunity that you've got, in line with kind of what's coming up in the next couple of days. If for example, you play the game and you're not playing a game for 7 more days, then you could argue that you don't need to be as aggressive in that acute window, and actually you can then use that breakfast, sorry, that meal, that dinner that they have, when they get home or back at the hotel, and then you can use the breakfast as a bit of a recovery breakfast. And we certainly use that in rugby because of the size of the blokes. And we're always advocating, eat like a king at breakfast the day after a game, because we know from some of James Hudson's work that resting metabolic rate increases the day after a game in professional rugby players because they're essentially trying to repair the body.
One of the things I'm really curious within that, I've worked a little bit in rugby and seen a few beer cans in my time, and I'm sure you've seen many more with the amount of work you've done in rugby. You mentioned sort of like trying to get something good in them before they have any alcohol. How drastic a change does alcohol make? I'm sure there's no sort of benefit to them drinking post performance, but if you do get some goodness into them, how much does that sort of eradicate the negative effects of alcohol potentially? Obviously, it depends how much they go on to booze, but how sort of detrimental is it, and how much can you negate it?
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of context specific here to the question, depending on who the player is, how many minutes they've played, what level of inflammation and damage have they sustained. But I think any of us would agree that the best outcome is that alcohol isn't consumed. Having said that, and you know what? When I worked in rugby league, it was almost like a given. Everyone would crack a beer open in the change room, staff and players. And now, whether it's the new players coming through, whether it's just society itself, but it isn't a big thing that we see in certainly in our changing room. And it's quite nice to see that, actually, because it's less of a battle for me to have. But the question that I also ask people is, in that moment, yes, there is a argument to say that you've just had an amazing win with each other, like having a beer, toasting the celebration. Is one beer going to cause a detrimental effect to the overall recovery in the next 24 hours? Some would argue that that's not, and it's going to give absolute positivity for social connection with teams and a band of brothers that have just gone out on a field and had a test match, which I agree with. There is research to show, I think it's Ben Desbro's work from Australia, where um, actually one beer, I think it was one bottle of beer, rehydrated the body quicker than water alone. And the reason for that is because you've got sugars within beer, right? It's not just water. So the some guys that you mentioned that to, they're like, oh, okay, so you're actually saying have a beer post match. And of course, there's a context behind that. Maybe one beer is okay. And then, of course, you then shift into the recovery, and that doesn't lead into 7 or 8 beers because that's going to negate anything that you're trying to achieve with recovery. Um,
I won't clip the moment where you just said that drinking one beer hydration better than water. That'd be a bit cruel on your reputation.
yeah, yeah. Well, I think look, if the evidence is out there, um, so yeah, and like we have the opportunity if they want a beer, but like I said, I think maybe it's the level that I'm working at, but the boys realise, they're sore, they're damaged, and they do want to recover. They don't want to feel damaged and sore for 72 hours if they can make that 72 hours 36 hours if they can, or 48. So it isn't a massive thing that we see at the moment, and I just think, yeah, the more elite athletes you work with, the more they realise it doesn't really offer them anything. And by the way, the 0% Guinnesses now, the 0% lagers,
Yeah.
they taste just the same. So I think more and more people now are happy to have a beer without the alcohol in.
Besides kind of alcohol, how big a gap is there between what sort of like conventional textbooks say in nutrition and maybe what you've lived experientially working as an applied, person in the field?
In regard to alcohol or just in general?
Just in general, not in alcohol. Yeah, how big a gap is there between textbook knowledge and then sort of practical application?
Yeah, I mean it's probably something that you only learn when you then start becoming an applied performance nutritionist because the textbook is incredible and it gives you that underpinning knowledge of wider metabolism and applied physiology, which is crucial. But then you work with athletes that if the textbook says that they should be having 60 grams an hour of carbohydrate, as an example, to optimize high intensity performance, yet you've got somebody who's a 35 capped test match rugby player that's having zero carbs. You look at it and you go, well, the textbook says that you should be hitting premature fatigue, but you're playing 80 minutes and you still get man of the match performances. So there is definitely a gap there, and really it's our job to then look at the literature and say, right, based on the published literature, what's got the closest ecological validity to the population of athletes that I work with? Then you start forming the genuine performance nutrition strategies for that sport and for that level of athlete. And then the job really is to try and nudge them as close as you can to increasing that uptake so that it goes from 0 grams to 100 grams of carbohydrates per hour. And what you then tend to see is for these athletes that have always not done it, they then bring in 100 grams of carbohydrates an hour and they feel incredible. And the second half performances maintain, they're not dropping off. High speed running maintains, they're finishing games stronger than they started. And I think that's the subjective feedback that I get from some of the players is that, wow, like I've probably underfueled my whole career and actually never realised that. So I think that power there is quite important, but there is a gap. I mean, and we quite often say that the elite athletes are pushing the boundaries. They kind of do stuff that isn't in the textbook, and then we start to study it, and then we realise, oh right, okay, the Tour de France riders in the 60s that were drinking cans of Coke up the mountains, like we never really knew why they were doing that. And then we started to study that glycogen and sugar intake helps with cycling performance. And then we realized that caffeine as an ergogenic aid helps with performance. So the athletes, even in the 50s, 60s, were ahead of the research. So I think that gap will always be there. And the athletes, quite rightly so, they push the boundaries on the research, and then they make us kind of become inquisitive as to how or why they're doing it, and then we go and study it.
Yeah. What are the sort of like common problems or common things that you're addressing nutritionally in athletes? Like what are sort of common things where nutrition maybe goes wrong that you're often working on with athletes?
I think it is the gap. I genuinely do between the research and what athletes actually do, because you've got to remember that it's us that has studied a master's in nutrition or a PhD, or you've gone and done a UKSCA and you've become an accredited S&C coach. Like the athletes don't know all of the nuances of sprinting techniques and how to elicit training adaptation from mitochondrial biogenesis. Like they don't know that, and they shouldn't. Their job is to be a pro athlete. We know that information, and so we have to be an elite level coach and teacher to then get that information across to them in a way that they understand. And I'll give you a great example, like creatine intake. You know, I still meet athletes that do not take creatine consistently. And if they do take it, they might have 3 grams here, 5 grams there. Some of them are like, well, I only thought you needed it like before the gym, or, you know, do you not only need it on game day? And you look at it and you go, you know, for years, there's so much research on the beneficial effects of creatine consistently. Took at 5 grams. Now we're beginning to realize actually there's a relative dosing amount of creatine at zero point 0.1 to 0.14 gram per kilo of body mass. So if I've got a 100 kilo player, actually it's a 10 gram intake of creatine now for both skeletal muscle health and then cognitive health. They don't know that. They don't read that research. It's us. And so we have to then coach them. So there is definitely a gap between what we read, what we know, the evidence, and then their understanding of it. And actually, they might have been told it before, but they got told that information on the same day as a game, or the same conversation as a coach told them some tactics for a fixture, and it's gone one in one ear and out the other ear. And they, oh yeah, someone did mention to me before that creatine was important. What's it do again? And that's some of the kind of not issues, but that's a lot of the conversations I'll have regarding genuine understanding of performance nutrition, like the textbook, like unbelievable positive evidence, and then your ability to consistently execute that in practice. And I think underpinning all of that is the importance of that athlete's trust and rapport that they have with us as a practitioner. Because I liken it sometimes to, if I said to you, oh, who's your favorite teacher at school? Straight away, there's someone that you think of. Why is that? Well, because you got on with them. Like you liked them as a person, or as a bloke, or as a lady, and you got on with them. So actually, when they asked you to do something, like you listened and you wanted to do it. And I think it's exactly the same with us. You know, if they don't like us and they don't get on with us, sometimes they're not even going to give us the time of day to have a conversation about caffeine or creatine.
I feel like your world compared to mine as a physio as well is different in the sense that everybody eats, everyone has their opinions on food, everyone's heard probably a decent amount of misinformation on nutrition in their lives, more so
Yeah.
than they have on anything rehab wise. You know, like the exercise equivalent would be don't squat with your knees over your toes. That would be the sort of like nonsense that you'd hear maybe in more of an exercise capacity. But I just think there's so much more bad information in nutrition that you must be up against day to day with athletes, just in terms of like the creatine example.
Yeah, there is, and it's beautiful in one sense because there's always a conversation at the dining table because you've nailed it. Like whether we like it or not, every single human mammal on Earth eats food. And so everybody, quite rightly so, is entitled to their own opinion on what works for them, what might not work for someone else. You know, whether it's keto, whether it's having these injections that helps with weight loss, or you know, I can drink a coffee at any time of the day and it doesn't affect my sleep. You know, you name it. There's conversations out there every single day, and then it's our job again to decipher almost with a filter. And you know, I'm shaking it, and I'm like, that's just a load of cod wallop that goes out. This has got an element of truth to it. Let's have a discussion about that. And it's our job to do that. And because if you don't do it, before you know it, there's somebody that has tried a strategy, it works for them. They tell their mate, they tell someone else, and then all of a sudden you've got 4 or 5 athletes that are doing something that you didn't even know about. And actually the research and literature behind it is terrible, you know, and it was done on 17-year-old pre-diabetic patients from a university in India, and you're like, lads, hang on a minute, like, where's the ecological validity behind that research? Like, that doesn't migrate to our population. But it's great in one sense because it always opens up conversations, and it's important for us. Like, we don't know everything, but we are the qualified nutritionists, and we are the ones that have gone and studied it. And so it is our job to, you know, interject where we can, cut out the BS and say, no, 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 don't worry about that. Like, this is the literature, this is the research, and this is what's going to fuel winning football, rugby, boxing performances. And my little thing here as well, and I might rub people up the wrong way here, but look, I'm not a medical doctor, so I would never comment on a doctor prescribing XYZ with a player because it ain't my lane. It's not my industry. Likewise, I'm not an S&C coach. So if I went into the gym and saw an exercise, I just wouldn't comment on it. You know, I just wouldn't say anything because it's not my job to. Like, it's not my discipline or area. But everyone wants to comment on food. Everyone wants to comment on the menus. Everyone wants to comment on, why is that here? Why have you done that? Why this? And that's just the reality of having everyone in the team or in the organization that eats food. So I think you have to build up a bit of tough skin just to kind of deal with that and not take it to heart all the time as well. Because I've had many conversations where sometimes I throw it back and I'm like, look, I'm not writing a menu for staff here. I'm writing a menu for this boxer to go and win a world championship fight, or this group of under 21s European England football players to go and win the European Championship. I'm not writing the menu for the staff. And so, yeah, sometimes you have to sit people back down.
What are the kind of strategies that you use to sort of finesse these changes or maybe re-education points with athletes? And the reason I ask is, like, if I have an athlete or a patient come and see me from a physio perspective, and they have really strong beliefs on maybe why they have pain, I'm very much trained academically to start with leading questions, open questions, get them speaking, get their beliefs, opinions, and sort of get more information from that process to then try and sort of finesse and steer the conversation in a productive way. Does it differ how you approach it with nutrition? Is there sort of like common ways that, the athlete says something that's maybe factually wrong about creatine or whatever it is, or how much carbohydrate they need? Is there sort of like an approach that you commonly find yourself taking to sort of like re-engineer their opinion on that nutrient or food-related thing?
Yeah, I mean, some of my best outcomes here, really, unlike physio or lying on the bed where they might have a problem that needs fixing, and there's a genuine need there. Like, I need you because, like, I've got a sore tendon or muscle. Can you help me? And then they want to listen to you because they're like, just whatever you say, I'll do, and I'll go and do that in rehab because I know that that's going to help. Sometimes our conversations aren't like that, and we need to just have a bit more of an open conversation to say, hey, look, I always try and build the rapport and the trust first. So before diving in and saying, by the way, mate, I think you need a relative dose of creatine because you're well undershooting it, I'll try and get to know the bloke first. Let's just have a general chat over a coffee and, talk to me about, your rugby career, family, kids, wife, like what's going on outside of rugby. I quite often ask that, like, what have you got going on outside of rugby? I want to know you as a person. And that then allows me to build that rapport, build the trust. And then when the time is right, you can then start opening the conversation into, look, out of interest, do you want to have a sit down and we'll talk about what's going on with nutrition at the moment? Tell me areas when, in your opinion, the nutrition strategy that you followed has been world class and you've felt at your best, like your best training session, when you've been in the best body composition of your life, when you felt like you could play for days and like nothing was getting in the way. Like, describe to me, like, what is that? Like, what did it look like? What were you eating? What was the strategy you followed? So I quite often open with conversations like that, and you then pick what path you want to go down with, like, the answer that they give you. It could be sometimes they're like, oh, do you know what? When I was at my best, I just had a consistent routine with things. I knew what worked. I knew what I needed to eat. I had a plan that I followed. The wife was helping with the meals. It was pre-kids actually, so we didn't have children in our life. And then you're like, okay, isn't it interesting that all of that worked when these core underpinning factors were in place? So that's how I'll kind of lead my conversations, really, to get to know the boys and get to know what works for them and what doesn't work for them. And then I always follow an approach that we did at England Football, me and Chris, where we built out our nutrition curriculum for the FA. And three pillars that we used to always follow were case study credibility and role model behavior, and then embed it with science. So the case study credibility, like if I'm talking to an academy rugby player, and they want to be in the senior team, I'll quite often say to them, "Hey, do you want to know what X player in the senior team eats leading into a game?" And because they want to be in the senior team, they're like, "Yeah, definitely, like he's my favorite player." So then you start bringing in a bit of role model behavior with the case study credibility, because they don't really care what I eat. They want to know what that player eats to then allow them to go and do an international test match. And then embedding it with science and the core underpinning of science. I will always drip feed, whether it's a slide, whether it's a conversation, a sentence, I'll always drip feed in an element of science so that they know that I'm not just making this up, and that there's actually, fact over opinion, evidence defeats doubt. And it's really important that they understand that what I'm giving them is not just me making it up. Like, this is genuine research that to allow you to become the best rugby player that you possibly can. So as an example, when I did the PhD study where we took muscle biopsies, what we actually realized was that if you follow a high carbohydrate diet leading into match play, your starting muscle glycogen before the game is a lot higher than what it might be if you follow a low carbohydrate diet. And we actually did that at Liverpool John Moores in a muscle biopsy study. Now you've got them because they're like, "What? Muscle biopsies? What's that?" And then you talk them through that. So that's probably the three pillars that I would follow, when kind of educating the players on strategies and trying to get them to buy into your nutrition philosophy.
Does your approach have to really change if it's like an academy player? Because obviously at the sort of beginning of that part of our conversation, you mentioned, you'll ask a player like whether they really felt like their nutrition was world class, they performed and felt great. How much do you have to bend that to being you just kind of not talking at them but educating them more if they're an academy player where maybe they've gone through their teenage years and they've just gone home and food's been put on their plate, and now they're full time with the team, say in rugby.
Yeah.
And they maybe don't have that awareness or maturity yet in their awareness of nutrition yet. How different does the approach go when maybe they can't name when they've experienced world-class nutritional sort of interventions?
Yeah, I mean, there's a level of like pastoral care that comes into that with the academy players, because it might lead itself more to I'm going to hold your hand as we go through this together, and we're going to kind of work on this strategy together. Like, I'm going to tell you what works really well with the senior guys, and we're going to drip feed some of this in kind of step by step, and we're going to layer it on until we can move you a little bit closer to where I want you to get to. And it's really important at that age as well that you don't just throw a grenade at them and you give them every single thing you possibly know. And it's up to us as the coach that when you have that initial needs analysis, kind of you look at it and you go, right, what really is the low hanging fruit here that this individual just isn't doing well enough? And I know that if we change that tomorrow, he's going to feel the benefit. And it's probably something like genuine fueling leading into the game, rather than, as an example, the cherry active supplements. Like, don't worry about the cherry gels yet. Like, what we need is we need this individual going from 2 gram per kilo up to 6 gram per kilo of carbohydrate content a day before the game. So I think that's really important. And then as you get as the player kind of that you're working with is more senior, they've got more caps. What you tend to see at that level is that they know what works for them, but they're not elite all of the time. They're not 10 out of 10 every single day, every single meal, every single competition, and there's deviations in that. And then it's about finding out what those are and why they're occurring, and why are they happening, and then what can you bring in to support them that's going to allow them to get that more consistent behavior. And I think that I always will say to my players is, look, I don't play rugby, I don't play football, I don't box, like, and I never will at your level. My job as a practitioner is to make you the best world champion boxer I possibly can. And there's so many little things I can do nutritionally that's going to help you get there, whether it's making weight better, whether it's rehydrating a little bit better, whether it's bringing in an extra bit of carbohydrate or creatine to help with muscle glycogen resynthesis. In the rugby sense, it's like at the moment you are under fueling going into the game. Like, I can see it, I've observed it. you're telling me that you only have one carbohydrate gel. I'm telling you, as a practitioner and as a researcher and as a scientist, it isn't enough. And I bet my house is if we increase that by 20, 40, 50, 60 grams of carbohydrates, you're going to feel better in the game. So can we nudge this together? Because my job is to make you a better rugby player. That's it. And that's kind of how those conversations will differ a little bit from that young, fresh academy player versus the person that might already have their routines and systems in place.
Yeah. We've obviously just had sort of you've obviously just been away with the England team on their camp and, and sort of tournament. How does the sort of game day nutrition work? Can you give us like a walkthrough of when that starts? I guess is probably the first question, and kind of give us the roadmap of what a normal day would look like, maybe game day.
Yeah, so look, I mean, in international football, international rugby, and boxers, like once they've made weight, it all becomes quite similar, really. I would say preparation for games from a nutrition point of view starts the day before. So I'd just like to add that kind of
Yeah.
disclaimer in there that the match day minus one fueling strategy is the most imperative, and making sure that glycogen content within the muscle is absolutely saturated as much as it possibly can. And you'll do that by hitting 6 to 8 gram per kilo of carbohydrate over the course of the day. When we then get to game day, if you've done match day minus one correctly, then game day becomes an opportunity to top up. So the bulk of what you've done has been done the day before in terms of glycogen saturation, and now we're topping up liver glycogen, we're topping up a little bit of muscle glycogen, and that doesn't really have to be super aggressive. If you've got an early kickoff, midday kickoff, what you might find actually is that the player that likes to lay in the morning, they might lay in and get up, and then they have one meal, and that one meal is almost a bit of a breakfast brunch slash pre-match because they've woke up at 9. The kickoff is at 12. They're going to eat by half 9, and then we would always say kind of your last big meal 3 hours before kickoff, and then after that you just want to be nibbling on carbohydrate availability, snacks and liquids and foods. If you've got a later kickoff like a 9 p.m., then of course you've got an even more extended period of that day where you can consume carbohydrates. And a lot of our fixtures recently were they ranged between 3 and 5 p.m. So what we naturally had was we had an extended breakfast service, which normally finished at 10, half 10, and then we would have like an extended lunch service, which would be our pre-match slash lunch. So our boys on game day were having two scheduled opportunities to increase carbohydrate availability. But of course, some of our players would come down early for breakfast. They'd go back upstairs, chill out a little bit, and then they'd come back down at half 10, and they'd kind of have another nibble of something, and then they'd then have their pre-match. So actually, their opportunity was, instead of just two meals, it was maybe three or four actual eating windows. And the guidance on game day then is, like I said, it's to top up liver glycogen, and it's to top up that any muscle glycogen that you might need to if you've got that later kickoff. And it can range anywhere between kind of 1 to 4 gram per kilo of carbohydrate on game day, depending on the size of the athlete, how many meals. I will always there's a big I've seen such a big not trend, probably an athlete desire, I would say is probably the better word, to not feel heavy going into competition. And I hear it more and more and more now that athletes, they want to feel light in here. They don't want to feel like they're carrying a big meal in their stomach when they're playing the game. That's the reason why we always say 3 hours before kick off your last big meal. But I'm seeing it more and more now that elite level athletes, they want to consume their carbohydrate content via liquids. They're more than happy to drink their carbohydrates from fluids than sit down and have a big meal. So what I see at the moment is a bit of a blend of liquid carbohydrate availability from juices, from cordials, from pre-made carbohydrate electrolyte solutions, and carbohydrate dense, nibbly type foods like pancakes with a bit of honey, banana bread with some Greek yogurt and honey, a white chocolate based porridge that our lads love in the morning on game day. So they're not having like massive meals. Even at pre-match meal, they might come down and have a bit of pasta and bolognese, but it's not huge considering they're big rugby boys. They're just topping up. They're just staying topped up from like nibbling through the day so that they don't go into the game starving, but they don't want to go into the game feeling really heavy here and trying to digest something.
Yeah, very cool. And then I guess the last thing, and you've probably touched upon it, I'd imagine a lot with carbohydrate, but what are the sort of like low-hanging fruits that you go after to make marginal gains or more significant gains in people's performance? And I'm sure carbohydrate is a big part of that from what you've said so far.
Yeah, do you know what? It really is because, and I want people to listen to this and just rewind it and maybe listen to it again because um, in the elite athlete worlds that I work in, whether it's boxing, football, rugby, or even your real key high rock style athletes, I think we've all ticked protein now. I think people know that protein, high protein intake is great if you're an athlete and you want to gain muscle mass and you want to recover. And I don't see a big problem with protein. I really don't. Where I see the problem is that people are still a little bit afraid of carbohydrates because they think that it's the carbohydrates that are making them fat, and they're worried that if they have a high carbohydrate diet, then they're gonna just put on this fat mass and body composition isn't going to be favorable. But it comes at the detriment sometimes of actual training performance and actual competition performance. So carbohydrates fuel muscle glycogen, which fuels training performance. And carbohydrates are king when we go into competition. And I've seen so many athletes across all the sports I've worked in at different levels that they're trying to compete at the highest level of their sport with a iPhone battery charge that's got 50% on it. And I'm like, it's incredible that you're competing at this level, but you're going into it effectively two-thirds fueled, like where you should be. And I think if we bring in another 200 grams of carbohydrate the day before, I think you're going to feel great tomorrow. And that's the outcome that I get quite often just from nudging them from carbohydrates. And yeah, you don't want to go super large on carbohydrates every day of the week. Of course you don't, because that isn't nutritional periodization and you're not fueling for the work required. But when it's about competition, there are still so many elite level athletes that think that they're consuming large carbs, but what they're doing is they're consuming large intakes of calorie, but it's because they're still consuming a lot of protein. And protein's still quite an abundant food that appears on all of their plates. Whereas actually, if you just parked 50 or 60 grams of protein and brought in 50 and 60 grams of extra carbohydrates, the total calorie content of your day is going to be the same. But actually, you've brought in 50, 60 grams more fuel ready for performance. So I would say that at all levels is still a big one. And then I think creatine, there's not many athletes that are doing it consistently well in and around training competition. And actually, we're now beginning to understand from the research that muscles become very greedy with creatine. So 5 grams of creatine a day for a 100 kilo athlete probably isn't enough. And like I said, if we're going to go off that relative dosing strategy now, zero point 0.1 as a minimum, well, we actually know they need 10 grams of creatine a day if we're gonna satisfy the muscles and then find any of it in the brain after that. So I think creatine is really hot and trendy at the moment, but I mean, it has been for years for skeletal muscle mass, but now we're beginning to realize the cognitive side. And in caffeine as well. I think there's a bit of a dichotomy with caffeine because it's so present in sport, but also I do wonder how many athletes would benefit from leading into a game, going a little bit lower on caffeine, so that when they get to the game, they get a bit of a better response to it. Because before you know it, in these environments, when you're on camps with England football and you're traveling around the world, or you're with your boxers, you're sitting down and you're chatting and you're chilling, and before you know it, you've had 3 or 4 flat whites a day. And actually leading into competition, maybe it would be better to have one flat white in the morning the day before and then a couple of decafs so that when you then have the caffeine on the day of the game, it's going to give you a bit more of an effect, an ergogenic effect. Um, so yeah, that would probably be the low hanging fruit, I would say. Yeah.
Cool. No, that's really helpful. I think the creatine thing is something I've heard more recently, listening to just less performance orientated shows, and things like Chris Williamson where he talks to people about lots of different topics. But I feel like I've seen that as a more mainstream
Yeah.
topic recently, like the cognitive effects of creatine. And
Yeah, and just on that as well. So from a carbs, and like if we just focus on the carbs and the creatine, whether it's Formula One drivers or whether it's darts players or whether it's your defender in football or whether it's your fly half in rugby, the cognitive load going through that brain in that competition is incredible. And considering that the brain is 2% of the body weight but takes 20% of your calorie needs every day, we know that this organ is incredibly energy greedy. And so I just always think about, I want my players to be able to make the most accurate, reliable, consistent decisions that they possibly can with what they're scanning during the game, millisecond decisions. And considering that one of the primary um, metabolites in the brain is glucose, and we get glucose from carbohydrates. And then considering that we know that creatine is in the brain and it acts as this reservoir for cognition and health, they're two things that I think if people focused on and got right, then you wouldn't be making decisions because you're fatiguing in the brain. And I think it would enhance a lot of performances. And we know from there's that classic sleep deprivation study that got published last year, where you've got, I don't know whether you're aware, but Group A, Group B, they both do cognition tests, speed of processing, accuracy, memory. They then both go through, I think it's 20 or 21 hours of sleep deprivation. And then you've got Group A that will have a placebo, and Group B will have 20 grams of creatine. And then they both do the brain tests again. Group A's data obviously falls off like a cliff, and Group B's data, I don't know whether it's statistically the same, but the data is so much better than Group A's. And what have they had? They've had this acute high dose of creatine. And it's really interesting to try that in practice. I've spoke to a few practitioners, and I've done it a little bit myself. I've got two young kids at home that are ill. When you're a little bit fatigued and you're a little bit tired, and then you have this high dose of creatine, anecdotally and subjectively, I mean, I feel it, and I've spoke to a couple of others that are doing it in practice, and there is something there with it. So yeah, I would say carbs and creatine.
obviously, creatine's a really current one at the moment, and it should be, and there's a lot of good evidence behind it by the sounds of it. Is there anything that's really current? Obviously, there's always fads and fiction in nutrition. Is there
Yeah.
anything at the moment that is really mainstream that we could just call a load of crap? Is there anything that you're sort of seeing at the moment that you're fed up of hearing about that is trendy in the wrong way at the moment?
Yeah, I've got to be careful what I say here, but I think an emerging area is the whole nootropics landscape,
Yeah,
and nootropics. Creatine's a nootropic, omega 3's a nootropic, caffeine's a nootropic, but I think there's more and more emerging mainstream nutrients that people are starting to consume that we're seeing on the market, lion's mane, ashwagandha, etc., etc. But I think we've got to be really smart and careful about where the literature is, and how much of that literature can genuinely be applied to the cohort of people that you're working in. If it's an ingredient that showed really promising effect in rodents, like great, like that's really cool, but we kind of need to see it transferring over into the human population. That's not to say it won't, and it might not do it in a couple of years, but we've just got to be really smart on that side of things. Um, and then an area that's I'm getting more and more conversations on now, which isn't necessarily performance nutrition, but it's these weight loss jabs, and it's the industry there about people that are taking the jabs, because fundamentally their underlying behaviors and habits are not the best. And they're just using these jabs as a bit of a short-term fix to go, well, I can do 6 months of this and lose 15 kilos and happy days. I haven't got to go to the gym. And I think what we're beginning to see now from the literature is that, okay, yes, you might lose fat mass, but also because you're not training and you're not eating as much now, we're also losing skeletal muscle mass, which actually is a bit of a huge detrimental effect for the overall body composition. Because yeah, a drop in fat mass is great, but we don't want to be losing muscle mass. Jesus, like we spend so much time in the gym and so much effort and load to build skeletal muscle mass. The last thing we want to do is try and lose it. Um, and again, the bit that kind of gripes on me is because the underlying behaviors underneath all of that is you still haven't gone to the gym and you're still reverting to poor nutrition behaviors. So you haven't really fixed anything. You're like the moment that you stop taking the jabs, like you might be slimmer, but you're from a body composition point of view, probably unhealthier because you've lost all of this muscle mass. And then what are you going to do if you're not somebody that used to go to the gym? Are you going to go to the gym now when you've just lost a load of muscle mass and it's going to take a bit of effort and time and sweat to build it? So I think that's an area we've got to be really careful about. Like there is definitely a need and a desire for clinically obese, high heart risk individual. You need to get the weight off them quickly. Like that's really
It's like a
a
triage
population.
situation there, isn't it, rather than a long-term thing? But
Correct, yeah, and I had a good discussion with a friend recently who had kind of dabbled in it, and I said to him about the importance of training and eating high quality, good quality proteins to make sure that he's looking after his muscle mass as well. So it was just to finish that up that um, it's an area that's obviously going to be emerging all the time, and there's going to be serious amounts of money to be made from companies, but I think it's our job again to remind people that it's the behaviours underneath that will ultimately dictate long-term outcomes on that.
yeah, no, well said. I'm aware of time, and I know I've taken a lot of yours off after a really busy patch of work you've had recently. Where can people find you? And also, I'm aware you've got a sort of like network and community yourself. Where can people find that? What is it, and where can people find you?
Yeah, great. So yeah, the Performance Nutrition Network is an online global community of performance nutritionists, dietitians, and we do have chefs in there. We do have people that are from the S&C background in there. But the whole idea of the community is that we learn from each other. So, I've got my strategies that work in sport, and so has over 100 other people now. And what's quite nice in there is that people will put questions in to say, "Hey guys, I'm traveling to South Africa for the first time with my team. I've never gone overseas. What do I need to consider from a nutrition point of view?" So you're not going to learn in there about mitochondrial biogenesis and muscle protein synthesis, but what you are going to learn is all of the nuances of being an applied performance nutritionist or dietitian and how to support your athlete or team to the best of your ability. And it's all of the lessons, it's the shared experiences, it's the knowledge exchange that we can all give each other. And then we host internal webinars, there's some in real life events that we host. And it's just a very, very safe place as for practitioners to learn from each other. We've got Premier League practitioners in there to Formula One to international rugby. So it's a really cool place to be. So that's the Performance Nutrition Network. That's on all of my socials and LinkedIn. And then yeah, if people want to chat, please add me on Instagram or LinkedIn. And yeah, open up a conversation. I'm all for networking and communicating with people that are interested in performance nutrition.
Nice, no, perfect. Well, mate, thank you for your time today. I really appreciate getting you on the show and actually just selfishly being able to ask you questions that I want to know the answers to. So,
Yeah,
hopefully,
all
and I'm
good.
sure our listeners will have benefited as much as I did as well.
No worries. Thank you very much.
Cool. I'll stop recording there. Was that okay for you?